In the last section, we spoke about declaring variables using const and let. So the rule is simple. We do not use var to declare variables anymore. Instead, we use either const or let. If we expect a variable to change, we use let, and if we expect it to not change, we use const. All right, not bad. Like, we can summarize those rules in like a couple bullet points. So right now, I bet you're having a reaction much like the one that I had when I first read about this change with ES6. And that reaction was, why in the world did the writers of ES6 decide to make this change? Why in the world can I not just use var? You know, var seems pretty darn straightforward. Why do I now have to use var and let, or excuse me, const and let all over the place? So let's talk about that reason. In complex JavaScript programs, we might have variables flying all over the place. You know, just tons of variable declarations. Who knows what we're doing? Just variable declarations all over the place. So although we strive to have tiny functions and small blocks of code, because we try to be good software engineers, sometimes we can write functions that grow to many lines of code. So let's look at a practical example. I'm just going to copy paste some code on the screen here because I want to focus more on why we're using const and let as opposed to actually writing any code with it. So I just copy pasted on a bunch of code on the screen, and you'll notice I am using a for loop here because I just want to give you a very messy example. So I've got a function called count, and the purpose of count is to count the number of vowels in a string. So we walk through the current length of the string, and if a given character includes a vowel, then we increment number, and then at the very end we return a number. So this very long string that I have right now, it appears I have 10 different variables in here. Okay, so I want you to imagine, with just that very brief overview, I want you to imagine that I told you right now, I want you to make some critical change to this function. Okay, I want you to make some big refactor to this. I want you to change it in some fashion. What would you have to do before you actually started typing anything at all? The first thing you would have to do is study the existing code here and try to figure out what was going on, right? Of course, you would have to figure out what was going on with the code that was already written here. I want to suggest that maybe that wouldn't take that much time, especially since I more or less just told you what was going on here. But I want to make 2 updates, and then I want you to kind of tell you to do the same exact thing. So I'm going to change that first var to a const, and the second one to a let. So I've now got a const and a let here instead of 2 vars. And now I want to tell you the same thing. I want you to look at this, and I want you to make some critical change to it, right now, right? You got to figure out what's going on, refactor it in some fashion, whatever it might be. So by using const and let instead of var now, I would argue that the code that we are looking at now is more legible and easier to understand what's going on. And here's why. By just looking at these first 2 lines here with the variable declarations, I immediately see that I have a const variable of characters, and that is an array. What this tells me as an engineer who's reading this code, maybe for the first time, is that in all the code to follow, I would not expect characters, like this variable, to ever change. All right, I would not expect this variable to change. I also see the variable number is declared with let, and that tells me with just a tiny glance that I do expect this variable right here to change over time. So at some point in time in the code below, I expect number to be changed. And so just by using const and let instead of var, it more easily helps us get a handle on the code that we're writing whenever we're coming back to code that we have not looked at in a long time, or maybe some other engineer wrote. That is the entire point of const and let, in my personal opinion. Other people will give you very technical reasons for it, but my opinion is that we use const and let to make code more instantly legible by informing our readers, here is something that I expect to change over time, and here's something that I expect to just be constant throughout the entire run of this function right here. All right, so maybe you don't believe me. Maybe you're saying, yeah, Stephen, that sounds like a stretch. Maybe you're not quite of the same opinion of me just yet. So I'm going to replace the code on the screen right now, and I'm going to throw on a much more complicated snippet of code. So complicated, I'm going to have to scroll out a little bit. I hope this is still reasonably legible on your screen. So this is an actual function that I wrote. It is just super messy, very large right here. It could definitely use a refactor. But when I was first putting it together, I said, okay, I just got to get this thing done. I'm going to do it all in one go through. And so you will notice I use, reduce helper in here, which is kind of neat. Actually, what is really neat about this is actually the function that parses the code that you put in this code editor right here and print stuff up in here. So this function right here is actually used in the tool that we're using right now. Just a little side note. Anyways, my point here is that if you look at this function, it is a total mess, right? If I told you to go make some critical change to this thing, you're gonna be sitting there, chances are you're gonna be sitting here for a while and figure out what was going on. You're gonna have to look at all the different variables that are declared, check out all the different if statements, and figure out, okay, in what case would I enter like this if statement or this if statement? And even if I get in there, what variables are changing? What is changing over time? So by changing these var declarations over to const and let, I'm going to argue that it's going to greatly clarify what is going on inside of this function. So let's see what happens. I already know which of these lines of code actually change and don't change, so just take my word for it that I'm doing it correctly here. So we're going to go to const. This will be a let, and then everything inside is a const as well. So just by making this change right here, I'm going to argue that it clarifies the intent of this function overall. By declaring some variables up here with const, it tells me that this variable right here is something that I can make reference to throughout the rest of the function, everything else in here, and not have to worry about it changing at some point in time mysteriously. I can look at this tokenized variable, and I don't know what tokenized means. I don't know what the variable represents, but I do know that if I figure out what's happening right here with this line of code, then I know that anywhere else inside this function, I can make reference to tokenized and know that it is the same as this value right here, whatever that produces. Similarly, once I get down into the reduce block down here, and I'm looking at line number right here, I know that line number will never change because I'm using the const keyword. I know that end of line will never change because it's using const. And so just by using these const keywords, I can infer a lot more about the variables that I have access to inside of this function and maybe what they might be used for as well. And so that is why we use const and let as opposed to just var. When I used var, I have no information about these variables. I know what they start off as, but I don't really have any assurance as to whether or not, we get down to line 21 right here and all of a sudden transform code gets updated to some completely different variable or some different contents. Okay, so I think I've harped on about the purpose of const and let long enough now. Let's continue in the next section and work on some refactoring of some existing code using const and let. And so for these examples you're about to work on, by necessity, they're going to be pretty straightforward, not too crazy. Don't overthink them too much. All we're doing here is I just want you to get a sense of thinking about when you might use const and when you might use let. Okay, so give a shot on the exercises, and I will talk to you in just a moment.